That night they left quietly, without slamming doors, without saying goodbye, without leaving any unnecessary words behind. I didn't understand it right away. At first, it seemed to me that the house had simply fallen silent, like an old clock before it starts ticking again. The silence wasn't abrupt, but cautious, as if someone was afraid to wake me, even though I wasn't asleep. I sat in the armchair, my legs covered with a blanket, and listened. With age, hearing becomes strange. You begin to distinguish not sounds, but their absence. I waited for the familiar footsteps, the quiet conversations behind the wall, the movement of air in the corridor. But nothing happened. The house suddenly became too spacious, and this feeling was almost physical, like the cold that creeps in unnoticed. I didn't get up right away. My old body doesn't like sudden movements, and my soul wasn't in a hurry either. I went to the window and saw the empty yard. The car was gone. The lights in the neighboring windows were out. Everything looked as if the night had carefully wiped away the traces of their presence. Only I remained. And this loneliness was different, not familiar, but new, wary. They didn't tell me they were leaving. They didn't explain where or why. And perhaps the silence was the most disturbing thing. I had lived too long with people who thought I didn't need to know anything extra. Later, in the morning, we'll figure it out. These words often serve as a curtain behind which something important happens, but not for you. I walked slowly through the house, touching the walls, as if checking if they were still there. The kitchen was too neatly cleaned. That's how you clean, not before going to bed, but before leaving. There were no cups or spoons left in the sink. Even the trash had been taken out. This cleanliness was suspicious. There was no care in it, only finality. I returned to my room and sat on the edge of the bed. Fragments of conversations from the past few days began to surface in my mind. Unfinished phrases, glances that were averted too quickly, decisions made without me. At the time, I didn't pay much attention to it. Old age teaches you not to interfere, not to ask questions, so as not to seem intrusive. But that night I understood that silence is not always protection. Sometimes it's a trap. It became clear to me. They didn't leave just like that. And they didn't leave me here by chance. I had the feeling that something had already happened, and I was left only with the waiting. Not an explanation, just waiting. This feeling is hard to describe. It doesn't scream. It doesn't panic. It just sits inside and doesn't let me sleep. I lay down, but sleep wouldn't come. In the darkness, the house breathed differently. Every rustle seemed louder than it actually was. I thought about the dawn, about how it always brings answers, even if you're not ready for them. And this time, for some reason, the dawn frightened me more than the night. I didn't know exactly what would happen in the morning, but I was sure it would be something that would change my life. Not loudly, not abruptly, but in the way that the fates of elderly people change, quietly, almost imperceptibly, but forever. I lay there and stared at the ceiling, counting my breaths, and for the first time in a long time, I felt that I wasn't just alone. I was on the threshold of a secret that, for some reason, they had decided not to share with me. And this secret was waiting for dawn. The night turned out to be longer than usual. Not because the clock was ticking slower, it was ticking, I could hear it, but because I experienced every minute separately. With age, time ceases to be a continuous stream. It breaks down into sensations, thoughts, memories, and each of them demands attention, as if afraid of going unnoticed. I got up and walked around the house again. not out of worry, but out of the need to make sure that everything was really as it seemed. The corridor was cool. The air was still, like in a room where the windows hadn't been opened for a long time. I peeked into their bedroom. The bed was made too neatly. People don't do that if they're planning to come back in the morning. There was an empty space in the closet where their jackets used to hang. I closed the door slowly, as if I was afraid it would slam shut and confirm my suspicions too loudly. I returned to the kitchen and sat down at the table. My hands rested on the oilcloth, familiar down to every scratch. I had lived many years at this table. Decisions were made here that were later called accidental. They talked about the future here, without looking at me. Here, they nodded at me more often than they answered me. And it was here, among familiar objects, that I suddenly felt acutely. They didn't leave me because they forgot about me. They left me because it was more convenient that way. The kettle boiled, but I didn't pour the tea. It cooled on the stove while I sat and stared into space. The last conversations played over and over in my head. Phrases that contained too much caution. Words that were left unfinished. I remembered how they assured me that everything is under control, that there's nothing to worry about. I had heard these expressions before. They always meant the same thing. The decision had already been made, just not for me. I thought about the dawn. There were still a few hours until then. Usually I loved this time, when the night begins to recede and the world is not yet noisy. But that night, the dawn seemed not a promise, but a sentence. I felt that the morning would bring not an explanation, but consequences. That I would have to deal not with people, but with facts. I went to the front door and checked the lock. Everything was locked. Too locked. I suddenly realized that I didn't know where they were. And this realization was new. Before, they had always left me at least the appearance of participation. Now, they hadn't even left me that. I was alone not just physically. I was excluded from what was happening. I sat down in the armchair and covered myself with a blanket. My body craved rest, but my thoughts wouldn't let go. I thought about my life, about how often I had agreed to wait for explanations, to wait for the right moment, to wait for everything to sort itself out. Old age teaches you to wait, but rarely explains that sometimes waiting is a form of self-denial. Sometimes I thought I heard a car outside the window. I would startle, listen intently, but it was only the wind or some distant sound. Hope came and went, not lingering. And with each passing moment, I understood more clearly. They wouldn't return until morning. Or maybe they wouldn't return at all. At some point, I caught myself thinking a strange thought. What if dawn brought not misfortune, but liberation? This thought was timid, almost indecent. I was used to fearing change, especially at my age. But that night, fear was mixed with something else, with weariness from the unknown. Sometimes the unknown is more tiring than the truth, no matter how difficult it may be. Sometimes life brings small surprises. Link in the description. I remembered how many times in my life I had been left alone with decisions made by others. How often I was told that it would be better this way, and how rarely that better took me into account. These memories weren't bitter. They were clear, as if my whole life had been slowly leading me to this night. When the clock struck 4, I realized that dawn was coming soon. My heart was beating steadily, without panic. I no longer tried to guess what would happen. I was simply preparing to meet the morning, alone but not helpless, because somewhere deep inside, An understanding was already forming. Whatever they left me at dawn, a secret, a problem, or a choice, I would have to accept it myself. And in this waiting, strangely enough, there was a sense of calm. Not certainty, not joy, but the calm of a person who has finally stopped waiting for others to decide everything for them. By morning, I was tired not from insomnia, but from my thoughts. They walked in circles, but with each new circle they became a little clearer, as if the night was gradually stripping away the unnecessary layers. I realized that I no longer expected their return, not because I was offended or disappointed. Simply, the waiting had ceased to make sense. The house was too quiet for hope. I got up when the first streaks of light fell on the floor. Dawn entered cautiously, like a guest unsure of whether they were welcome. I opened the window. The air was cool, fresh, almost indifferent to my state. And in that indifference there was comfort. The world didn't know about my anxiety, and therefore, it wasn't the whole world. I brewed some tea, and for the first time that night actually drank it, hot and strong. It brought me back to my body, reminding me that I was here, that I was alive, that morning had finally arrived. Old age often makes a person a prisoner of their thoughts, and such simple actions are a way to return to oneself. I decided to check my mail, not because I was expecting a letter, but because I always did that in the mornings. Habits are the last thing that are taken away from us. There was an envelope in the mailbox. Thick. Official. I immediately understood that it wasn't accidental. Such letters always have a certain feel even before you pick them up. I went back into the house and sat down at the table. I stared at the envelope for a long time without opening it. I needed time. I already suspected what they had left for me at dawn. Not an explanation, not a farewell, but the consequences. Documents know how to speak for people, especially when people prefer to remain silent. I opened the letter slowly, carefully, as if I was afraid of tearing not the paper, but the remnants of my former life. There were formulations, dates, signatures. I read and reread it, because the language of such letters is cold and doesn't take age into account. The lines formed a picture that I had to understand myself. The decision had been made without me, but with my participation. Formally, legally. Humanly, empty. I won't go into details. The point wasn't in them. The point was that I was left alone with something that should have been discussed. I wasn't given the opportunity to ask questions, to object, or even to prepare myself. They left me with a piece of paper and silence. And that was, perhaps, the most honest manifestation of their attitude. I put the letter aside and closed my eyes. There was no panic in my chest. There was a feeling similar to what you feel after a long illness, when the doctor finally tells you the truth. Scary but clear. I no longer had to guess. The secret of dawn was revealed, and it turned out to be not a catastrophe, but a challenge. I walked around the house and looked at it differently. Not as a place where I was abandoned, but as a space in which I would now have to make decisions. The walls were silent. They neither supported nor condemned. They simply were. And suddenly I understood. For the first time in a long time, no one expected me to be accommodating. No one expected me to smooth things over, to adapt, to remain silent. I was left alone with the fact, and that's what made me free. I sat down and began to remember. Not them. Myself. My life before this house. Before these people. Before the habit of being secondary. I remembered moments when I made difficult decisions on my own. When there was no one to turn to. when there was fear, but it didn't stop me. These memories didn't make me younger, but they restored my sense of continuity. I didn't begin here, and I won't end here. By midday, I was tired. Not physically, but inwardly. But it was an honest tiredness, not exhaustion. I lay down to rest, and for the first time that night, I fell asleep. The sleep was light, but peaceful. There was no anxiety in it. Only images of the past that no longer pulled me back. When I woke up, the sun was already high in the sky. The house was filled with the sounds of the day, distant, but real. I picked up the letter again. Now, it didn't scare me. It had become a task. And I understood. This is only the beginning. They left, thinking they had left me with a secret. In reality, they left me with a choice. And choice is something they haven't taken away from me yet. I didn't know what the next step would be, but I knew it would be mine. And that knowledge turned out to be more important than any explanations. A small surprise is waiting in the description. After midday, the house filled with light, and along with that light came a strange feeling of order. Not external, but internal. The mystery of the dawn no longer weighed on me, because it had ceased to be a mystery. The papers lay on the table in a neat stack, and I no longer averted my gaze from them. They didn't disappear, they didn't change, they didn't demand immediate decisions from me. They simply were, as a fact. And I was better at dealing with facts than with hints and unspoken implications. I reread the letter again, slowly, without haste. Now I noticed details that had escaped me that morning. Phrasing that left room for action. Words that could be challenged. I realized that I hadn't been presented with a closed door. I had been presented with a corridor. Long, cold, but passable. And this realization was the first real relief in the last 24 hours. I went to the bathroom and washed my face for a long time. The water was cool, and I let it run over my face a little longer than usual. In the mirror, a woman looked back at me, tired but composed. I suddenly saw clearly. Something had changed in me that night. Not disappeared, not broken. On the contrary, it had come together. Like people gather themselves before a long journey. I dressed as if I were going out, although I wasn't in a hurry. A clean blouse, a neat jacket. Not for anyone else, for myself. Old age often deprives a person of reasons to pull themselves together, and because of this, the body begins to forget how to do it. I didn't want to forget. I went outside. Just like that. I needed space where my thoughts could move freely. The autumn was calm, without wind. People were going about their business, and no one knew that for me this day was the boundary between before and after. And there was something comforting in that. The world didn't demand explanations from me. I sat down on a bench and allowed myself to think about them. Without anger, without resentment. I understood that their departure was neither an escape nor a betrayal. It was a decision made in their usual logic, faster, more convenient, without difficult conversations. They didn't mean any harm. They simply didn't consider it necessary to take me into account. And this difference turned out to be important. It freed me from hatred. I returned home closer to evening. The house greeted me calmly. Not empty, calm. I suddenly understood that this silence was no longer hostile. There were no expectations, demands, or tension in it. It didn't ask me to be someone else. It allowed me to be myself. I sat down at the table again and took out an old notebook. I hadn't used it for a long time. It contained entries made in different handwriting at different times in my life. I opened a clean page and looked at it for a long time. Then I started writing. Not a complaint, not a plan, just thoughts. What I know, what I can do, what I no longer want. Writing turned out to be easier than I expected. The words flowed calmly, without trembling. I wrote about needing time, that I wasn't obligated to solve everything at once, that I had the right to ask questions, and that this right didn't depend on whether someone left in the night or stayed. When I closed the notebook, it became clear I was no longer waiting for their return to start something. If they returned, the conversation would happen. If not, it would still happen, just in a different place and at a different time. I was no longer a hostage to someone else's silence. That evening I went to bed early, without anxiety. Sleep didn't come immediately, but it was peaceful. And for the first time in a long time, I fell asleep not with the question, what will happen to me, but with the question, what will I decide? It was a small difference, but it changed everything. The mystery of dawn turned out not to be something to fear. It turned out to be the point from which the road begins. And I felt that there would still be difficult days ahead, conversations, documents, decisions. But there would no longer be nights where I was left alone, without anyone feeling the need to explain. I was no longer just the one who was left behind. I became the one who was left behind, and understood what to do next. The morning after that night no longer seemed like a continuation of anxiety. It was like a pause in which I could finally straighten up. I woke up early, even before the city started to stir, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't listen to the house. I no longer needed to guess who was where and what was happening. The house was mine, at least for this hour, at least in this feeling. I slowly got dressed, put on the kettle, and opened the window. The air was fresh, with a slight dampness, as it is before a clear day. I stood by the window and thought about how strangely courage is structured. In her youth, she is loud, sharp, and noticeable. In old age, she is quieter, almost invisible from the outside, but far more stubborn. She doesn't demand applause. It's enough for her that you take the next step, even if no one else sees it. I picked up the documents again. Now, they didn't scare me. I looked at them like a map, not a sentence. I noted what I needed to clarify, where to ask, who to contact. I didn't make plans for years ahead. I thought about the coming days. Old age teaches this better than any books. Don't overload the future, but deal with the present. I left the house closer to noon. Not because I urgently needed to go somewhere, but because it was important for me to feel the movement. I walked slowly, stopping along the way, but I didn't feel weak. Every step was deliberate. I wasn't walking away from someone, but towards myself. The institution I entered was noisy. People were talking loudly, interrupting each other, rushing. I sat in line and looked at their faces. Young, tired, irritated, lost. I suddenly realized that I had a rare advantage. I had nowhere to rush. My time no longer belonged to other people's expectations. And there was a quiet strength in that. When someone spoke to me, I answered calmly. I didn't make excuses, I didn't fuss. I stated my name clearly. With each time, it sounded more confident. I asked questions that I wouldn't have dared to ask before. And they listened to me, not because they felt sorry for me, because I spoke clearly. Returning home, I felt neither victory nor fatigue. It felt as if I had done something very simple and very important, reminded the world of my existence. Sometimes that's enough to move something that has been standing still for a long time. In the evening, I sat down to write again. This time, not thoughts, but steps. Small steps. Realistic steps. What can be done tomorrow? What in a week? Where I need to be present in person, and where a letter is enough. This wasn't a list of struggles. It was a list of self-care. And that was new for me. I caught myself no longer being afraid of their return. Before, this fear was constant. What they would say, how they would look at me, what they would decide. Now it's gone. Not because I stopped caring, but because I no longer made my existence dependent on their reaction. That night, I went to bed early again. The sleep was deep, without dreams. And when I woke up, the first thing I felt wasn't anxiety, but interest. Cautious, but genuine. What would happen next? Not what they would do to me, but what I would do. I understood. They had left, leaving me alone with a secret, but they hadn't considered one thing. Dawn not only reveals secrets, it gives direction. And I, despite my age, could still walk. My steps were quiet, but they were my steps. The morning they returned didn't surprise me. I no longer waited for it with anxiety, but I didn't consider it ordinary either. I woke up early, as I was used to, and sat by the window for a long time, watching the light slowly fill the courtyard. This time, the dawn didn't carry secrets. It carried the end of waiting. I heard the sound of a car and didn't flinch. I simply noted it as one notes a change in the weather. Inside, I was calm, almost serene. I already knew that whatever happened next, I wouldn't return to that night where they had left me alone without a word. It was impossible. Some steps cannot be undone. They entered the house quietly. Too quietly for people who were confident. I heard the rustling of keys, cautious footsteps, muffled voices. They weren't in a hurry to meet me. Perhaps they hoped to postpone the conversation. But the conversation no longer waited for their readiness. I went out into the corridor myself. Not quickly. Not demonstratively. I simply went out. I saw confusion in their faces. Not fear. Rather surprise. They expected to see the old me. Tired, silent, grateful that they had returned at all. But I was different. Not stronger outwardly. Calmer inside. We didn't talk for long. I didn't reproach them. I didn't ask questions I didn't want to hear the answers to. I only said what was necessary. That I knew. That I had figured things out. That decisions would no longer be made without me. And if it's impossible, then the path forward will be different. I spoke softly, but it was this very quietness that made the words weighty. I saw them trying to find arguments, explanations, familiar excuses. But they no longer worked. Not because they were lies, but because they came too late. The conversation ended without shouting, without drama, simply with a period. Sometimes a period is more important than any exclamation mark. I didn't expect apologies, and I didn't receive them, and that didn't hurt me. I no longer needed confirmation of my rightness. I was already living it. When they went to other rooms, the house filled with movement again. But this movement no longer overwhelmed me. I sat in an armchair, covered my legs with a blanket, and for the first time in a long time, I felt that everything was in its place. Not perfect, but honest. The dawn I had feared turned out not to be an end, but a confirmation. The mystery of the night didn't destroy me. It awakened me. Time passed. I can't say exactly how much. In old age, days stop adding up in a neat count. They are more like breaths, one after another, without haste, without the need to mark each one. But I felt that something stable had settled within me, like a foundation that no longer needed testing.
The house changed.
Not immediately and not completely. There were still tense pauses, unspoken words, cautious conversations. But the main thing disappeared, the feeling that I was here temporarily. My presence was no longer perceived as background. It became a fact, and that changed everything. I lived slowly, very slowly, but there was no emptiness in this slowness. There was attention to the mornings, to the light, to my own feelings. I learned again to listen to myself without rushing to adapt to other people's rhythms. My body no longer allowed for fuss, and now I was grateful for that. It taught me to stop. Sometimes I returned in my thoughts to that night, not with pain, with gratitude. If they hadn't left then, if they hadn't left me alone with the mystery of the dawn, I might have continued to live, accepting a role that was gradually erasing me. That night became a boundary. Not tragic, not loud, just precise. I was no longer afraid of loneliness. I understood that loneliness and abandonment are not the same thing. I was abandoned, but I didn't remain empty. I remained with myself, and that turned out to be the most reliable company. I continued to take small steps. Somewhere I asked questions. Somewhere I said no. Somewhere I simply remained silent because I didn't want to speak. These choices no longer seemed audacious or inappropriate to me. They were natural, like breathing. Sometimes people approached me and said that I had changed. I smiled. I didn't explain. Explanations are also a form of justification, and I no longer justified my existence. I often sat by the window at dawn. Now, without anxiety, dawn had become a time of certainty for me. It reminded me that the night always ends, even the longest one, even the one in which you are left speechless. If someone asked me what I learned from this story, I wouldn't answer immediately. I would think. And then I would say softly, like old women say when they no longer need to convince anyone, sometimes life takes people away from you to give you back to yourself. That night they left, leaving me alone with the secret of what would happen at dawn. And at dawn I happened. And that was enough to continue living.